Kız yigit xurlanğan, ayak asti kılınğan, ezilgen şu halkının kullarını süygün baminin. Feryadım asman felek, dökülgeçke hanselde, ejderhanın aksidim, vatanımni algın baminin. Azgın Uyghur ey, vatan kuldum her güçlügey. Ay yıldız ayrılım, kötü yüzüne pürgün baminin.
Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. Welcome to a very special episode of Talk is Turkestan. Today I have with me Sir Geoffrey Nice. Sir Geoffrey Nice is the chair of the Uyghur Tribunal. He has been a barrister since 1971 and has served part-time judge in England between 1984 and 2018. Between 1998 and 2006, he led the prosecution of Slobodan Milošević, former president of Serbia, at the UN's International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He was Gresham College Professor of Law from 2012 to 16 and was chair of the China Tribunal. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sir Geoffrey Nice to our podcast. How are you, sir? How are you today?
Good evening.
Thank you for giving your special time to be on our podcast. I guess I'll get straight to it. Now, of course, we now know that based on the tribunal's findings, that the Uyghur Tribunal has come to the conclusion that China is committing a genocide and crimes against humanity. Could you briefly explain what the verdict entails?
Well, first of all, yes, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. And as I've explained to you, I can't go into the judgment to argue it for several reasons. First of all, the judgment speaks for itself. The second thing is, I'm not an activist, and the members of the tribunal are not activists in the Uyghur cause. That may seem strange, but if I say we don't care about the Uyghurs any more than we care about other victim groups, it sounds a bit harsh, but it's actually to reflect the fact that what we were doing when invited to do it by the World Uyghur Congress was filling a gap in information and knowledge for citizens all around the world that had been left as a gap intentionally by governments and the UN and everybody else, and it needed filling. So that's what we did. The judgment says how we went about the process, and the conclusion was that under international standards of law, the PRC was revealed to have committed acts of torture, the crime of crimes against humanity, and the crime of genocide, but the crime of genocide under one limb only, and that's the fourth limb of the five possible ones, that of interfering with the process of giving birth to children. So that's what the judgment amounts to. Now, the judgment also reveals quite carefully the decision-making process that the other 8 members and I, all of us equal members, went through in order to reach this conclusion. And it's quite important to take time to think about that and to look at it, because this has become, genocide generally has become, in particular, but this, and the Uyghurs also in particular, have become subjects of great general discussion, that sometimes people get carried away with themselves, and you need to stop, take a step back and really be careful about what you're being asked to consider. And so we went through a very precise route. We listened to live witnesses, many of them people who had an experience of the camps, many of them, nearly all of them in translation, some of them indeed interpreted by you very, very well, if I may say so. and in very difficult circumstances organized by the tribunal. So we had live evidence. What do you draw from that? What can you decide from that? Then we resourced or sourced other evidence. For example, the factual evidence given to other organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and so on, that we didn't have, add that in. Then you have expert evidence on all sorts of topics and from all sorts of experts. And only then do you say, okay, that's where we've reached. Now what does the law tell us? And we will apply the law in the most strict way possible. And we'll fix on ourselves the highest possible standard of proof, which was proof beyond reasonable doubt. And we came with, and that led to the conclusions, the unanimous conclusion of the 9 members. Okay.
Thank you for that. Now, this tribunal, throughout its hearings, has been discredited by the Chinese government, whether it be through slander, calling the witnesses liars, and questioning the funding of the tribunal because it was backed by the World Uyghur Congress and these Western powers, so to speak. What do you say to the Chinese government and others that use this argument to discredit the tribunal and its verdict altogether?
Well, I'm afraid it's a bit of a silly argument, but let me explain why without reference to the Uyghurs. If there's something that people perceive as a problem and somebody wants the problem dealt with, it's most likely to be someone who's affected. Sometimes, yes, you could have, say, a huge foundation that would look around the world and say, well, is there a problem somewhere that we'd like to spend our money on and sort it out? That didn't happen here, and there isn't any such foundation. So it's always going to be an interested individual or group that's going to set something in train, start something off. And so it was it was the World Uyghur Congress that said to me and to Nick Vetch, would we set up a tribunal? Now, everyone at the senior level, all the members, worked completely unpaid. No money in, and also we weren't prepared to fund it ourselves. If we'd funded it ourselves, assuming any of us had any spare money, then we'd have had an interest, a sort of financial interest in the outcome. So we're completely free of financial interest both ways. And so the seed money, if you like, has to come from someone. It came from the World Uyghur Congress. Once that had happened, then, of course, but there was crowdfunding, donations from all sorts of people, asked, unasked, because a lot of people have been troubled by the alleged problems in the Uyghur that we found are real problems. And I remember there was one young chap he's a lawyer actually in England, and completely unknown to us, about 30 years old, I think he was, not connected ethnically at all to Turkestan, although I think he's a Muslim. He just gave a really significant sum of money and a few days later died of natural causes. And it was rather touching because the first I knew of this substantial donation was after the chap had died. Quite extraordinary. And then there were lots of other people giving small amounts of money and people giving substantial amounts of money. But the other way of explaining what a sort of slightly silly question it is if you look at the most famous activist investigation of atrocities, it's the hunting of the Nazis after World War II. And guess who did that? Well, it was the Jews. And guess who seed funded any funding required? It was bound to be the Jews. That is the real world, and there's absolutely nothing wrong in it. But it also has to be said that the World Uyghur Congress, having asked us to do it, having provided some of the starter money, and indeed having assisted in locating witnesses and matters of that sort, was impeccable in maintaining a distance. It had no choice because we were going to maintain a distance of independence, but they had no trouble doing it. They were impeccable.
Thank you for that. Now, as you've known, we've all seen that the tribunal has tried to invite the Chinese government on many occasions to tell, their side of the story, so to speak. But they've opted to smear the tribunal instead. You would think that they'd rise to the challenge to put bed at the time, the allegations of genocide, even going to the degree of even sanctioning some of you, the tribunal members. So in your opinion, what does that tell you about the Chinese government? What is the world dealing with here?
Well, I think you've got to be cautious here, and realistic, because if you, as there was in 1960s, if you set up a tribunal to try the United States of America or any other country, big or small, but to try the United States of America, as happened in the 1960s for alleged crimes in Vietnam, and it was the first tribunal of the kind that we've set up and run. Was it surprising that the United States took no part in those proceedings? No, it wasn't. And if the United Kingdom was the subject of a non-formal tribunal investigating, say, the colonial history of the United Kingdom, would the government turn up? Well, quite possibly it wouldn't. So I don't think one should be too critical of them not turning up. It was very important that we asked them time and again. We would have been really pleased if they'd contributed. And as they didn't, we had to do all we could to understand what their argument and position might be. But no. And we certainly drew no inferences adverse to the PRC from the fact that they failed to turn up. That would be quite wrong. You do these things on the basis of the evidence you've got. And we have encouraged, interestingly enough, within the judgment, you all have noted that they're invited to consider the moral leadership they could give the world right now by agreeing for these matters to be dealt with at the world's highest court, for example. And if you think about that in a broader way, can you imagine the anxiety that would come to the United States and Russia and various other places if any one big country said, that's it, we're fed up with hiding truth from the people, we'll let you know what happened. I know it's a utopian world of mine, but if you don't dream, you will sometimes achieve nothing. So you might as well dream.
Yeah, and dream big, I guess. Even get to this stage, even to get it to this stage was, is a dream for a lot of Uyghurs. Before the show, you were asking me if I was happy. And a lot of Uyghurs are, how do you ask that, to be happy that, China is committing genocide on Uyghurs? But what you guys have done is at least sort of told the world, based on the evidence provided, yes, there is without a shadow of a doubt that China is committing genocide, which we are truly grateful for. Now, as you just mentioned before, this tribunal is in a non-formal court, itself has no powers of sanction or enforcement. But we're beginning to see, like I've just read today, that the High Court of England and Wales has granted permission to go to a full hearing, with UK authorities unlawfully allowing the importation of goods produced with forced Uyghur labor. Surely the hope is we see a lot more of this. How can, in your opinion, or in what ways can governments, international institutions, companies, educational establishments, and even individuals use the tribunal's judgment against the Chinese government?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and one for which I got quite a long answer. This tribunal and the one before, the one into forced organ harvesting that I chaired, both of which I chaired, are to a large extent constructed according to my principle which is that to the extent possible, there should be no specialists, no human rights activists, nobody on the panel, just citizens. And then the second thing is that we shouldn't make a list of recommendations. If you look at so many reports, well-intentioned, of course, having come to a certain conclusion, they then 2 or 3 pages of what other people should do. And what we've made clear is that it's certainly not for us to try and run the world, or any part of it. That's not for us. Nor should we assume that organizations who have duties to perform, or individual citizens who have duties to perform, will not perform them if they are properly advised as to the facts. On the contrary, we should assume of our fellow citizens that once properly informed, we will all do our duty because we are one family of human beings. We have rights, and those rights are reflected in duties which we owe to each other, so that it should never be the case that we have to even begin to tell people what to do. We simply give them a fact, and that's it. It's up to you. And so I'm not going to answer your question because it's saying in this very general way. Of course, there are people who have duties to perform in light of this sort of finding, or indeed the finding, although it was never articulated, of the United States government earlier on in the year, coming both from Pompeo, but also more significantly from Blinken. And the first people who've got duties to do is the People's Republic of China itself. But then, if you look around the world, who interacts with the People's Republic of China? Well, governments do, of course. And so things like trade agreements, all that sort of thing, and sanctions and so on. But schools do, universities do, travel companies do, and then you and I do. Well, you've got different motivation because you are Uyghur, but I'm not. But I nevertheless have a duty if I go off and buy a T-shirt, and if I know that it's made of cotton coming from Xinjiang, I have to think about it. And maybe I have a duty to perform. And so when you ask what happens to this, we hope that what happens is that we've provided a nugget, if you like, a little bit of information. That's it. Here it is. And we can be sure that you'll do your bit as a fellow human being. Now, that is, again, maybe utopian and big dreaming, but not so, I think, because, as you said, 1 or 2 institutions, parliaments here, there, everywhere, are beginning to pick it up and say, okay, what do we do with this? What's the next step? The United Nations Human Rights Council, I think, has announced that it's bringing its decision on the Uyghurs forward. So there we are. That's good, and so on.
But besides the high courts, that was a real the UN pushing its findings of what's been happening as well. So the tribunal has spent a long time, over a year, preparing, setting up, carrying out these hearings. So is that it, or will the tribunal have a role in following up on the developments of what's happening to the Uyghurs under the Chinese government?
Well, the pure position to take is we do nothing. We are literally like a jury returning a verdict. We hand the verdict in to the judge and we walk away. And we sort of did that with the China Tribunal, but eventually we came to realize that there were some circumstances where we could do a bit more. So that, for example, with the Uyghur Tribunal, with the China Tribunal, which was about forced organ harvesting, so it had a lot of hard medical facts to deal with. There was certainly one, and I won't specify which because I think it was in confidence, but there was one medical professional body that was troubled by this and wanted to be quite sure of how things had developed and how the findings had been made. And it seemed to us that that was not at all inappropriate for us. It wasn't inappropriate for us to go and talk to them. And then with that tribunal, we've also spoken to one or two representatives of parliaments around the world, simply to explain the position procedurally, again, not to argue the case. And so this time, I dare say, we'll be willing to do that, because although it is a verdict and it's there and you can read it, at the moment it's only whatever it is, 60 odd pages, and we're putting together the other 200 or 250 or something pages that it will come to, and that'll be available in a book form sometime early in the new year. But no, we'll probably be prepared to do a bit of talk, but not much, because there is this difference between an activist who has a clear function in life, whether it's a political parliamentary activist or an activist probably like you are, Arslan, for a particular cause, or a human rights activist looking at things generally, and the little jury, the jury of 9 people who say, okay, you've asked us this question, here's the answer.
We're beginning to sort of close down our show. I sort of have a question, sort of a two-parter, and you can decide to answer the first part or not, or just stick to the latter. And that because you were quite adamant that you're not an activist, but I still think it's worthwhile asking this question.
Okay.
You may know that our podcast is followed closely by the Chinese government and its propagandists, and listened to by our own Uyghur brothers and sisters. So do you have a personal message for the Chinese government? And also, do you have a special message for our Uyghur brothers and sisters who have been the victims of China's genocide, whether it be themselves who are persecuted or those who still have family members in the camps and prisons?
No, I'm not going to send a message to the Uyghur brothers and sisters, because to do that would almost certainly require me to express a personal opinion, and possibly even to try and see if I have an emotion.
Right.
And I have no opinion and no emotion outside the judgment. And similarly, I should have no message for the China government, PRC. However, I'm sure all tribunal members would hope that the PRC has seen in the judgment the very considerable respect that is accorded to them as a government. This is not a case of slagging off, being completely critical of a government or being anti-communist or anything like that. Not at all. We understand this is a huge government dealing with the world's most populous people, and of course with enormous difficulties. And towards the end of the judgment, in the last half a dozen pages, there's the question that's asked, as well as the question, why not go to the International Court of Justice and lead the world in openness? There's the question asked, given how powerful China is it really necessary to be doing this? And I think you'll find there's somewhere the question asked, could China have expected better of itself? And could the rest of us have expected better of China? I think it doesn't affect the judgment at all, but coming as I do from a relatively new civilization, after all, England was not particularly civilized until only a few hundred years ago, maybe 1,000, but even then it wasn't particularly civilized.
Yeah.
The same can be said of America, but with even greater emphasis. And where other Uyghurs may be in Australian places, likewise. China is a country with an enormous cultural history that must contain within it things we should be benefiting from. And it seems, maybe, I was about to use an emotional term, but I won't, so I'll use a neutral term. Unfortunate that things should end up this way when maybe they never needed to.
It's really great that, again, this just goes to show how independent, as you mentioned, like even after the tribunal, after the verdict, that you and other members are being. And hopefully this sends a message to how the courts in the so-called courts are run in China. Hopefully they can learn from you guys. With that, again, I want to thank you for your time, Sir Geoffrey. Is there anything else that you wanted to add towards the end, and then we can close off?
No, Arslan, it's been a very interesting exchange, and you reminded me, because I either didn't see the interpreters, or if I did, my my poor facial recognition means I didn't immediately recognize you. But
no, that's fine.
We were served by interpreters are a really valued resource, and it's a very difficult job, whether you're doing it sequentially or, which didn't happen in the tribunal, conference interpretation simultaneous. And we were very fortunate in having very high level skilled interpreters, including you, because without that means of communication, the whole process could never have happened. So thank you for that.
Thank you for, essentially providing the stage to be able to do that. Thank you to all our listeners watching and following. Make sure, please share this message out there so it gets out there. I will do a separate private goodbye with you, Sir Geoffrey, after the show. I'm just going to roll out the show with a video, and then we can say our goodbyes. So until next time, brothers and sisters, peace be upon you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Ümit üzme aziz halkım, ümit üzme ey ana yol. Biz atlandık bu güreşke, o yıl taştak uyuşup. Allah verse bu nusretni, bizgilerimiz